The notification sound pierced through the steam-filled bathroom like a knife. Carrie Neff paused mid-stroke while brushing her teeth, foam still clinging to her lips. Joaquin's phone buzzed again on the marble countertop, the screen lighting up with each alert. He was in the shower, humming some tune she didn't recognize, completely oblivious to the messages flooding his device. She shouldn't look. In 9 years of marriage, she'd never been the type to snoop through her husband's phone. Trust had always been their foundation, the bedrock upon which they'd built their life together. But something about the persistent buzzing made her stomach clench with unease. The third buzz came as she was rinsing her mouth. Through the frosted shower door, she could see Joaquin's silhouette as he shampooed his hair, taking his time like he always did on Saturday mornings. Their 7-year-old daughter Indy was still asleep down the hall, and the house felt suspended in that peaceful weekend quiet. Carrie's hand moved toward the phone before she could stop herself. The preview showed 3 messages from someone listed only as V in his contacts. Her breath caught as she read the visible text, "Can't wait for tonight. Wear that cologne I bought you." The phone screen went dark, hiding the rest of the message. Carrie stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, toothpaste residue around her mouth, her auburn hair still messy from sleep. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, someone whose husband was receiving intimate messages from mysterious contacts. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone. The lock screen showed a photo of their family from last Christmas, all 3 of them grinning in matching red sweaters that Indy had insisted they wear. They looked happy. They looked like people who told each other everything. The water shut off in the shower. Joaquin would step out any second, reach for his towel, then his phone. Carrie's finger hovered over the home button. She knew his passcode, had known it for years. His birthday backwards, simple and predictable, just like she'd thought their marriage was. She pressed the numbers. 5-1-7-8. The phone unlocked, revealing a string of messages that made her knees weak. The conversation thread with V stretched back months, filled with heart emojis, planning secret meetings, and words that should have been reserved for a spouse. The most recent message was even worse than what she'd glimpsed. "I picked up those La Perla pieces we looked at. Can't wait to show you how they look. The usual place at 7. Carrie's vision blurred. La Perla. She knew that brand, impossibly expensive lingerie that cost more than their monthly grocery budget. Lingerie that certainly wasn't meant for her, since Joaquin had never bought her anything from there. The usual place. How long had there been a usual place? The shower door clicked open. Carrie fumbled with the phone, her sweaty fingers nearly dropping it as she tried to close the message thread. The screen seemed to freeze, refusing to cooperate as panic flooded her system. Joaquin stepped out, water dripping from his dark hair, reaching blindly for the towel hanging on the hook. In seconds, he'd notice his phone was in the wrong position, or see the guilty expression she couldn't seem to wipe from her face. Finally, the phone returned to the lock screen. Carrie placed it back on the counter, trying to remember exactly how it had been positioned. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain Joaquin would hear it over the sound of him toweling off. "Morning. Beautiful." He dropped a casual kiss on her forehead as he reached past her for his phone. His skin still smelled like the expensive body wash she'd bought him for their anniversary, mixed with something else, a cologne she didn't recognize. "The cologne I bought you," V had written. Carrie forced a smile, hoping it looked normal. "Morning. How'd you sleep?" "Like a rock." Joaquin glanced at his phone screen, and she watched his face carefully for any reaction to the messages. But his expression remained neutral, almost bored, as he scrolled through what she now knew were intimate communications with another woman. "Indy awake yet?" "Still sleeping." The words felt thick in her throat. "I thought maybe we could do something as a family today. Go to the park, or that new miniature golf place she's been asking about." Joaquin's thumb was still moving over his phone screen, typing a response to V that Carrie couldn't see. "Can't today, babe. Rocco needs help with that downtown renovation project. You know how it is, weekend work pays double time." Rocco. His business partner and best friend since high school. Carrie had called Rocco's house just last weekend when Joaquin claimed to be there working late. Rocco's wife Esperanza had seemed confused, mentioning that Rocco was home watching a game and hadn't seen Joaquin all day. At the time, Carrie had dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Now, the memory felt like a punch to the gut. Joaquin finished typing and slipped the phone into the pocket of his robe. He moved around the bathroom with the same routine he'd followed for years: deodorant, hair gel, aftershave, but everything felt different now. Every gesture seemed calculated, designed to prepare him for someone else. "How late do you think you'll be?" Carrie asked, hating how her voice sounded like she was fishing for information. "Hard to say. You know, construction projects, they run long. Probably won't be back until after Indy's bedtime." He met her eyes in the mirror, and for a moment, she searched his face for any sign of guilt or deception. But Joaquin had always been good at hiding his emotions when he wanted to. It was one of the things that made him an effective contractor, keeping clients calm even when projects hit snags. "I'll save you some dinner. You're the best." Another casual kiss, this one on her cheek. "I need to get moving. Rocco's expecting me early." Carrie watched him walk back to their bedroom, whistling that unfamiliar tune. Through their bedroom doorway, she could see him getting dressed. Dark jeans, a button-down shirt that was nicer than what he usually wore for construction work, and boots that looked freshly polished. He was getting ready for a date. With V. At the usual place. The realization hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over the bathroom sink. 9 years of marriage. 7 years of being Indy's parents together. Countless conversations about their future, their dreams, their unshakable partnership. All of it was apparently a lie. Or maybe not all of it. Maybe this was recent. Maybe V was just a mistake, a moment of weakness that could still be fixed if she confronted him now, demanded the truth, insisted they work through it together. But even as the hopeful thoughts tried to form, darker questions crowded them out. How long had this been going on? How many work emergencies had actually been secret meetings? How many times had he come home to her and Indy with another woman's scent still on his skin? Carrie straightened up and looked at herself in the mirror again. The stranger looking back at her had rage building behind her eyes, but also something else. Determination. If Joaquin thought he could lie to her face while planning romantic evenings with someone else, he was about to discover exactly what kind of woman he'd married. But first, she needed proof. Real evidence, not just incriminating text messages that could be explained away. If she was going to confront the man she'd trusted with her heart and her future, she wanted to be absolutely certain of what she was dealing with. The next few hours passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Carrie made pancakes for Indy, helped her pick out clothes, braided her long dark hair while her daughter chatted about the book she was reading. Every domestic moment felt surreal, like she was acting in a play about someone else's life. Joaquin left at 10 with a travel mug of coffee and another kiss goodbye, this one feeling like a betrayal against her lips. Carrie stood at the living room window, watching his truck disappear down their tree-lined street. He turned right toward downtown, in the direction of several ongoing construction projects. Or in the direction of whatever hotel or apartment where he met V at the usual place. Indy was building an elaborate fort out of couch cushions, completely absorbed in her architectural project. Carrie's phone sat on the kitchen counter, and she found herself staring at it like it might spontaneously provide answers. She could call Rocco directly, ask if Joaquin was really coming to help today. But that would tip her hand, potentially alerting Joaquin that she was checking up on him. Better to be subtle, at least until she understood the full scope of what she was dealing with. Instead, she opened her laptop and began what would become an obsession, investigating her own husband. If you've ever discovered something that shattered your worldview in an instant, you know how Carrie felt in that bathroom. The moment when trust dissolves and you realize you might not know the person sleeping next to you at all. But here's what Carrie did that so many people don't: she didn't confront immediately. She didn't let emotion drive her decisions. She got smart first. Joaquin's credit card statements were accessible through their online banking, something they'd set up years ago for transparency in their finances. Carrie had rarely bothered to check them in detail, trusting that her husband wasn't hiding major expenses. Now, scrolling through months of transactions, she felt like an archaeologist uncovering evidence of a completely different life. The Meridian Hotel appeared repeatedly, always on dates when Joaquin had claimed to be working late or attending construction industry events. Charges at high-end restaurants she'd never been to, At times when he'd told her he was grabbing fast food with Rocco. A jewelry store purchase for $800 just 3 weeks ago, right around the time she'd asked him why they were behind on Indy's school supplies budget. But the most damning evidence was the credit card she'd never seen. Buried in their file cabinet, behind insurance papers and tax documents, she found statements for a Visa account in Joaquin's name that she'd never known existed. The credit limit was $15,000, and he'd been using it regularly for the past 8 months. Every charge told the story of an affair: romantic dinners, hotel rooms, expensive gifts, and even a weekend getaway to wine country that had happened during a weekend when he'd told her he was visiting his sick aunt in Sacramento. Carrie sat in their home office, surrounded by evidence of her husband's double life, feeling like she was drowning in paperwork and lies. Each bank statement was another betrayal, each hidden charge another crack in the foundation of everything she'd believed about their marriage. The secret credit card statements revealed something else troubling. Several large cash advances, totaling nearly $5,000 over the past 3 months. Cash was harder to trace, but it suggested that Joaquin's deception went beyond just romantic expenses. What did someone need that much untraceable money for? Her phone buzzed with a text from Joaquin: "Projects more complex than expected. Might be a really late night. Don't wait up." Carrie stared at the message, knowing it was probably a lie, knowing he was likely getting ready for his evening with V at that moment. The casual cruelty of it, lying to his wife while preparing to cheat on her, made her hands shake with fury. But anger wouldn't get her the answers she needed. She forced herself to think strategically, like the marketing executive she was at work. When a client was considering a major campaign change, she didn't make recommendations based on emotions. She gathered data, analyzed patterns, and built an airtight case. She needed to do the same thing here. Carrie spent the rest of the afternoon researching private investigators in their city. She needed someone professional, discreet, and experienced with infidelity cases. The reviews and credentials led her to Finch Holloway, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial investigations. His website promised confidential consultations and evidence that holds up in court. The phrase sent a chill through her. Court. Divorce proceedings. The legal dissolution of everything she'd built with Joaquin. Was that really where this was heading? She called Finch's office and scheduled a consultation for Monday morning, giving a fake name and paying for his services with her personal credit card, one Joaquin had never seen or had access to. If he could keep financial secrets, so could she. That evening, Indy curled up next to Carrie on the couch for their Saturday movie night, a tradition they'd maintained since she was old enough to sit through a full film. Tonight's selection was a Disney movie about a princess who discovers her entire kingdom has been built on lies. The irony wasn't lost on Carrie. Halfway through the movie, Indy looked up at her with those serious dark eyes that were so much like her father's. "Mama, why do you look sad?" "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Just thinking about work stuff." Indy studied her face with the unsettling perceptiveness that children sometimes possessed. "Daddy's working a lot lately." "He is. He's got some big projects right now." "Is that why he's different?" The question made Carrie's heart skip. "Different how?" "I don't know. He used to read me bedtime stories every night, but now he's always too tired. And he got mad when I spilled juice on his work shirt yesterday. He never used to get mad about stuff like that." Out of the mouths of babes. Even Indy had noticed changes in her father's behavior, the subtle shifts that indicated his attention and affection were being directed elsewhere. The realization that her daughter was already being affected by Joaquin's betrayal made Carrie's protective instincts flare. "He's just stressed about work, baby. It's not your fault when he gets upset." But Carrie knew it wasn't really about work stress. It was about a man who was emotionally and physically invested in another relationship, leaving scraps of attention for his family. It was about a father who was already beginning to detach from his daughter because his heart was elsewhere. That night, long after Indy was asleep, Carrie lay in their king-sized bed staring at the ceiling. Joaquin's side was cold and empty, his pillow undisturbed. The clock read 11:47 p.m., and she hadn't heard from him since his afternoon text. She wondered what V looked like. Was she younger? More exciting? Did she laugh at Joaquin's jokes in a way that made him feel more interesting than his wife of 9 years could? Or was it simply the thrill of something new, the dopamine hit of secret messages and clandestine meetings? The front door opened just after midnight. Carrie closed her eyes and regulated her breathing, pretending to be asleep as she listened to Joaquin's familiar nighttime routine. Shoes kicked off in the entryway. Keys dropped in the bowl by the door. The soft sound of him moving through their house, probably checking on Indy before coming to bed. When he finally slipped between the sheets, he smelled like perfume that wasn't hers. The scent was subtle but unmistakable, something floral and expensive that clung to his shirt and hair. He'd been with her. With V. While his wife and daughter waited at home, he'd been in another woman's arms. Carrie kept her breathing steady and her body still, but inside she was screaming. Monday morning arrived with the false promise of normalcy. Joaquin left for work with his usual kiss and coffee, Indy bounced off to school with her backpack and lunchbox, and Carrie drove to her office like it was any other day. But at 10 a.m., instead of attending her weekly marketing meeting, she was sitting across from Finch Holloway in his downtown office. Finch was not what she'd expected. Mid-40s with graying temples and kind eyes, he looked more like a college professor than a private investigator. His office was neat but not flashy, decorated with certificates and a few family photos that suggested he understood the value of what his clients were risking. "Tell me about your situation, Mrs. Chen." He used the fake name she'd given when scheduling the appointment. Carrie had rehearsed this conversation, but actually speaking the words aloud made them feel more real. "My husband is having an affair. I found text messages, credit card charges, evidence that he's been lying about where he goes and what he does." Finch took notes without judgment, his expression professionally neutral. "How long do you think this has been going on?" "At least 8 months based on the financial records I found. Maybe longer." "Do you know who the other woman is?" "Only that her contact name is V. The messages suggest they have a regular meeting place, probably a hotel. She mentioned buying lingerie, so it's definitely physical." "What outcome are you hoping for, Mrs. Chen? Reconciliation or dissolution?" The question hit her like a slap. She'd been so focused on gathering evidence that she hadn't fully considered what she wanted to do with it. "I don't know yet. I just need to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with." Finch nodded. "That's wise. In my experience, affairs rarely exist in isolation. There are usually other deceptions, other compromises to the marriage. Financial irregularities are common, as are emotional affairs with multiple people." "What kind of financial irregularities?" "Hidden accounts, unusual cash withdrawals, money being moved or spent without the spouse's knowledge. Sometimes there are larger schemes, people financing their affairs by redirecting family resources, or even by taking on debt that affects both spouses." The words sent a chill through Carrie. She thought about those cash advances on the secret credit card, the mysterious $5,000 that had been withdrawn over 3 months. What if Joaquin's betrayal went beyond just cheating? What if he was compromising their family's financial security to fund his relationship with V? "I'd like you to conduct a full investigation. Financial records, surveillance, background check on the other woman if you can identify her. I need to know everything." Finch quoted his rates and outlined the process. Within a week, he'd have a comprehensive picture of Joaquin's activities, complete with photographic evidence and detailed documentation. The cost was significant, nearly $3,000 for a complete investigation, but Carrie didn't hesitate. If Joaquin could spend their money on another woman, she could spend her money protecting herself and Indy. "Have you considered what you'll do if the investigation confirms your suspicions?" Finch asked as she wrote the retainer check. "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. But I want to be prepared for anything." The next week passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Carrie went through the motions of her normal life, work, parenting, household management, while knowing that Finch was out there documenting her husband's betrayal. She found herself analyzing every interaction with Joaquin, looking for signs of guilt or deception that she'd previously missed. He seemed more attentive than usual, bringing her coffee in the morning and asking about her day with what appeared to be genuine interest. Was he feeling guilty about his affair, or was this behavior designed to throw her off the scent? The psychology of infidelity was more complex than she'd imagined. On Thursday evening, Joaquin announced another weekend work commitment. Big commercial project downtown needs weekend attention. I'll probably be tied up most of Saturday. Carrie nodded and smiled, playing the supportive wife while mentally noting that Finch would likely capture whatever Joaquin actually did that weekend. The investigator had been discreet but thorough, confirming that Joaquin's work obligations rarely aligned with actual construction activities. The preliminary report arrived in her email Friday afternoon, marked confidential and encrypted with a password Finch had provided over the phone. Carrie waited until she was home alone to open it, her hands trembling as she typed in the access code. The document was devastating in its thoroughness. Finch had identified V as Valentina Russo, a 28-year-old real estate agent who worked for a high-end firm specializing in luxury properties. The photograph showed a stunning woman with long dark hair and the kind of sophisticated beauty that graced magazine covers. But Valentina's profession was just the beginning of what Finch had discovered. The surveillance photos told a story that was worse than simple adultery. Joaquin and Valentina weren't just meeting for romantic encounters, they were conducting business together. Images showed them touring expensive properties, meeting with what appeared to be financial advisors, and spending long hours in restaurants with laptops and documents spread across their table. Most damaging of all was a series of photos taken at a notary's office, showing Joaquin and Valentina signing official-looking documents while holding hands across the table. Finch's report explained what he'd uncovered through public records and financial investigation. Joaquin and Valentina had formed a limited liability company together 3 months ago. They were purchasing real estate properties using funds that appeared to come from accounts linked to Carrie's family trust, money she'd inherited from her father 2 years ago and had trusted Joaquin to help manage. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. This wasn't just an affair. It was embezzlement. Joaquin had been systematically moving assets from their joint accounts and her inheritance into business ventures with his lover, effectively stealing from his wife to build a future with another woman. According to Finch research, the couple was planning to purchase a luxury condominium in Costa Rica. Property records showed they'd already put down a significant deposit using funds that had been diverted from accounts Carrie thought were secure. She sat in her home office, staring at evidence that her husband wasn't just unfaithful, he was a criminal. The man she'd trusted with her finances, her future, and her daughter's security had been systematically robbing them to fund a new life with someone else. The final page of the report contained Finch's professional recommendation: immediate legal consultation advised. Evidence suggests ongoing financial crimes that could substantially impact the client's assets and legal standing. Time is of the essence in protecting remaining resources. Carrie closed the laptop and sat in the growing darkness of evening, feeling like she was falling through space. Everything she'd believed about her life, her marriage, and her future had been a carefully constructed lie. Joaquin hadn't just betrayed her heart, he'd stolen her father's legacy and jeopardized her daughter's security. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. A cold, calculating fury that felt more powerful than any emotion she'd ever experienced. Joaquin thought he was smart, thought he could manipulate and steal from the woman who'd loved him unconditionally. He was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, you know the moment when shock turns to anger, and anger crystallizes into determination. Carrie had reached that moment. She wasn't going to be a victim. She was going to be a strategist. The attorney's office occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city Carrie had called home her entire adult life. Blaise Thornfield was recommended by a colleague as the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state, someone who specialized in high-conflict cases involving hidden assets and financial fraud. Blaise was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made weak people uncomfortable. She listened to Carrie's story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Carrie finished, Blaise leaned back in her chair and studied the evidence that Finch had compiled. "This is quite comprehensive. Your private investigator knows his business. What kind of legal exposure am I looking at?" Carrie asked. "If Joaquin has been forging my signature on financial documents, does that make me liable for anything?" Blaise shook her head. "You're the victim here, not a co-conspirator. But we need to move quickly to protect your remaining assets and ensure your husband faces consequences for what he's done. What kind of consequences? Wire fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, these are federal crimes. If we can prove he's been systematically moving money across state lines or international borders, the FBI could get involved. We're not just looking at divorce court here. We're looking at potential criminal prosecution. The words sent a thrill through Carrie that she didn't expect. Criminal prosecution. Real consequences for the man who'd stolen from his own family. What's our strategy? First, we freeze everything. I'll file emergency motions to prevent him from accessing any more joint assets. Second, we gather every piece of evidence and turn it over to federal authorities. Third, we make sure you and your daughter are protected throughout the process. Blaze outlined a comprehensive plan that would effectively trap Joaquin in his own deceptions. They would use his relationship with Valentina against him, providing evidence to law enforcement while simultaneously protecting Carrie's rights in divorce proceedings. But the most important part of the strategy was timing. We can't let him know what we've discovered until everything is in place. If he realizes you're onto him, he might accelerate his timeline or move assets beyond our reach. How long do we have? Based on the property records your investigator found, it looks like they're planning to close on that Costa Rica property within the next month. That's probably when they'll make their final move, liquidate everything they can and disappear. 1 month. 30 days to build an airtight case and ensure that Joaquin's betrayal would result in justice rather than just heartbreak. Can you do it? Blaze asked, studying Carrie's face carefully. This kind of investigation requires you to maintain normal behavior with your husband while we build our case. You'll have to lie to his face every day, pretend everything is normal while we gather evidence. It's not easy. Carrie thought about Indy's college fund, which had been steadily drained to finance Joaquin's affair. She thought about her father's legacy, the money he'd worked his entire life to leave for his daughter and granddaughter, now being used to purchase love nests in foreign countries. I can do it. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in deception that would have impressed Joaquin himself. Carrie smiled and kissed her husband goodbye each morning, asked about his day each evening, and made love to him twice when he initiated, all while building a legal case that would destroy him. Working with Blaze and Finch, she documented every financial transaction, every suspicious behavior, every lie he told about his whereabouts. They discovered that Valentina wasn't just Joaquin's lover. She was his business partner in a scheme to flip high-end properties using stolen capital. The plan was sophisticated and might have worked if Joaquin had chosen a different victim. They were using Carrie's excellent credit and inherited wealth to secure loans for property purchases, then renovating and selling the properties at significant profits. All the proceeds were being funneled into offshore accounts controlled by the LLC that Joaquin and Valentina had created together. On paper, it looked like a legitimate real estate investment business. In reality, it was a complex embezzlement scheme designed to transfer the maximum amount of money away from Carrie before Joaquin disappeared with his lover. Blaze worked with federal prosecutors to build a criminal case while simultaneously preparing divorce papers that would protect every remaining asset. Finch continued his surveillance, documenting meetings between Joaquin and Valentina that showed their business relationship was inseparable from their romantic one. The breakthrough came when Finch captured audio of a conversation between the couple outside a bank where they'd just opened another account. Valentina's voice was clear on the recording. Once we transfer the rest of her inheritance money, we can close on the Costa Rica place and be done with this whole charade. Joaquin's response was even more damaging. She has no idea what we've been doing. By the time she figures it out, we'll be long gone and she'll be stuck with all the debt. They were planning to saddle Carrie with the loans they'd taken out while stealing the assets those loans had purchased. It was a level of cruelty that went beyond simple betrayal into calculated destruction. But their arrogance would be their downfall. The audio recording provided clear evidence of criminal intent, and Blaze immediately shared it with federal prosecutors who agreed to coordinate their arrest with the divorce proceedings. Everything came together on a Thursday morning in late October. Carrie kissed Joaquin goodbye as he left for what he believed was a routine day of work and infidelity. Instead, FBI agents were waiting at Valentina's real estate office with warrants for both their arrests. Carrie was at her own office when Blaze called with the news. They're in custody. Both of them. The federal prosecutor says they have enough evidence to pursue multiple felony charges. For a moment, Carrie couldn't speak. After weeks of planning and preparation, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. What happens now? Now we protect you and Indy while they face justice. I've already filed the divorce papers, and the federal charges will likely prevent them from posting bail. Your assets are secure, and Joaquin's going to spend a long time paying for what he did to your family. That evening, Carrie sat Indy down for the most difficult conversation of both their lives. She explained, in age-appropriate terms, that Daddy had made some very bad choices and wouldn't be living with them anymore. She promised that they would be okay, that they had family and friends who loved them, and that sometimes adults made mistakes that changed everything. Indy cried, of course. She was 7 years old and couldn't understand why her father had chosen to hurt them. But she was also resilient in the way children often are, adapting to new realities with a flexibility that adults envied. Joaquin called from jail that night, collect charges that Carrie declined to accept. She had nothing left to say to the man who'd stolen her trust, her money, and her daughter's sense of security. The time for conversation had ended when FBI agents placed him in handcuffs. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once federal prosecutors took over. Joaquin and Valentina were charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. The evidence was overwhelming, from forged signatures to recorded conversations to financial records showing exactly where every stolen dollar had gone. Joaquin's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal that would have reduced his sentence in exchange for cooperation and full asset recovery. But the federal prosecutor, encouraged by Blaze's aggressive advocacy, refused to compromise. This was a case that deserved maximum penalties. The trial lasted 3 weeks and attracted local media attention due to the sophisticated nature of the scheme and the large amounts of money involved. Carrie testified about discovering the affair, finding the hidden financial records, and realizing that her inheritance had been systematically stolen. Joaquin's defense attorney tried to portray him as a man who'd made mistakes but wasn't a criminal mastermind. The strategy fell apart when prosecutors played the audio recording of him and Valentina celebrating their plan to leave Carrie stuck with all the debt. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Joaquin was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Valentina received 10 years. Both were ordered to pay complete restitution, though most of the stolen assets were recovered through asset forfeiture before sentencing. Carrie sat in the courtroom as the judge read the sentences, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. This wasn't about revenge, though there was satisfaction in seeing justice served. It was about consequences. Actions had results, and betraying your family's trust came with a price that extended far beyond hurt feelings. But the most important victory wasn't legal, it was personal. 6 months after Joaquin's sentencing, Carrie was sitting in her newly renovated kitchen, watching Indy practice piano in the living room. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, freed from the weight of secrets and lies that had poisoned the atmosphere for months. Finch Holloway stopped by that evening, ostensibly to deliver the final invoice for his investigative services, but really to check on how she and Indy were adjusting. Over the months of working together, their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. "How are you holding up?" he asked, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into the kitchen chair that had once been Joaquin's regular spot. "Better than I expected." Carrie looked toward the living room where Indy was working through a complicated piece with the focused determination she'd inherited from both parents. "She's resilient. Kids bounce back faster than adults. And you? Are you bouncing back?" Carrie considered the question. The betrayal had changed her, there was no denying that. She was warier now, less trusting, more protective of her heart and her resources. But she was also stronger, more confident in her own judgment and capabilities. "I'm different. I don't think I'll ever be as naive as I was before, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I learned I can handle more than I thought I could." Finch nodded. "In my line of work, I see a lot of people at their worst moments. Most of them just want to survive the crisis and move on. You didn't just survive, You made sure there were consequences. Is that wrong? Sometimes I wonder if I should have just divorced him quietly instead of pursuing criminal charges. He stole from your daughter's future to fund his affair. He forged your signature and used your family's money to build a life with someone else. Those aren't relationship problems, those are crimes. Carrie knew he was right, but the aftermath had been complicated. Joaquin's mother, Estelle, had initially blamed Carrie for destroying the family by involving law enforcement. It took months of evidence and explanation before Estelle understood the full scope of her son's betrayal and began to repair her relationship with Carrie and Indy. Some of their mutual friends had chosen sides, uncomfortable with the public nature of the scandal and the criminal prosecution that had followed. Carrie had lost people she'd considered close friends, but she'd also discovered who truly supported her when things got difficult. The financial recovery had been more successful than anyone expected. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed prosecutors to recover most of the stolen money, including the Costa Rica property that had never been completed. Carrie's inheritance was restored, Indy's college fund was rebuilt with interest, and they had enough left over to establish a small trust fund for Indy's future. More importantly, the experience had taught Carrie skills she'd never expected to need. She understood financial documents now, could spot inconsistencies and irregularities that might have fooled her before. She'd learned about legal procedures, federal crime prosecution, and asset protection strategies. The knowledge came at a terrible price, but it was knowledge that would protect her and her daughter for the rest of their lives. A year later, Carrie was running her own marketing consultancy, having left her corporate job to pursue the independence and flexibility that came with entrepreneurship. One of her first clients was a non-profit organization that helped other women identify and escape financial abuse, a cause that had become deeply personal to her. The irony wasn't lost on her that Joaquin's betrayal had ultimately led to her professional liberation. The skills she'd developed investigating his crimes, the confidence she'd gained navigating federal prosecutors and complex legal procedures, the network she'd built working with attorneys and investigators, all of it had prepared her for a level of business success she'd never imagined possible. Indy was thriving too. At 8 years old, she'd adjusted to their new normal with the adaptability that children possessed. She visited her paternal grandmother Estelle every other weekend, maintaining that important family connection despite everything that had happened. But she'd also formed a strong attachment to Finch, who'd become a regular presence in their lives. The relationship between Carrie and Finch had developed slowly, built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect rather than the passionate infatuation that had characterized her early relationship with Joaquin. They were partners in the truest sense, two adults who'd both seen the worst of human nature and chose to build something better together. On a warm evening in late spring, as Indy played in their backyard and Finch grilled dinner on the patio, Carrie reflected on how completely her life had changed. The woman who'd answered that devastating phone call 2 years ago seemed like a different person. Naive, trusting, willing to accept surface appearances without digging deeper. This version of herself was harder, perhaps, but also more resilient. She'd learned that love without trust was worthless, that financial independence was essential, and that sometimes the people closest to you were capable of the deepest betrayals. But she'd also learned that survival was possible. That justice could be served. That starting over, even in your 30s with a young child, wasn't just possible but could lead to something better than what had been lost. The phone call that had shattered her world had ultimately been a gift, painful and devastating in the moment, but ultimately freeing her from a life built on lies. If there's one thing I want you to remember from Carrie's story, it's this: trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't ignore red flags because you want to preserve an illusion of happiness. Don't accept lies because the truth might be inconvenient. Most importantly, remember that discovering betrayal isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of your real life. The life where you're fully informed, properly protected, and surrounded by people who actually deserve your trust. Carrie's story teaches us that justice is possible, but only if you're willing to fight for it. Only if you're smart enough to gather evidence before you confront. Only if you're strong enough to see the process through to the end, even when it gets difficult. 2 years after Joaquin's sentencing, Carrie received a letter from him at the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. She almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of her. The letter was full of apologies and explanations, promises that he'd changed and hopes that they might someday rebuild their family. Carrie read it once, then filed it in the same folder where she kept all the legal documents from his prosecution. Not because she was considering reconciliation, but because she wanted Indy to have a complete record of what had happened when she was old enough to understand it all. Some betrayals were forgivable. Some mistakes could be overcome with time and effort and genuine remorse. But what Joaquin had done went beyond infidelity or poor judgment. He'd systematically stolen from his wife and child, planned to abandon them in debt while he built a new life with someone else, and shown no remorse until he was facing federal prison time. Those weren't the actions of someone who'd made a mistake. They were the actions of someone who'd never really loved his family at all. Carrie never wrote back. On Indy's 9th birthday, as friends and family gathered in their backyard for a celebration that would have been impossible to afford during the dark days when Joaquin was draining their accounts, Carrie felt a deep sense of gratitude for the phone call that had changed everything. Yes, it had shattered her illusions. Yes, it had caused pain that took years to fully heal. But it had also saved her from wasting more years in a marriage built on lies, protected her daughter from growing up with a father who would have eventually abandoned them anyway, and given her the strength to build something authentic and lasting. Estelle approached her during the party, carrying a piece of birthday cake and wearing the cautious expression she still got when discussing her son's crimes. "I want you to know how grateful I am that you let me stay in Indy's life. After everything Joaquin did, you could have cut me off completely." Carrie watched Indy laughing with her friends, wearing a birthday dress that had been paid for with recovered assets rather than stolen money. Indy needs her grandmother. What Joaquin did isn't your fault, and she shouldn't lose family because of his choices. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that woman hadn't called that day? If you'd never found out? Carrie had wondered about that alternate timeline many times. A version of her life where Joaquin's affair remained secret, where the financial theft continued undetected, where she remained blissfully unaware while her marriage and her security slowly crumbled around her. I think I would have found out eventually. Maybe when they disappeared to Costa Rica, maybe when the bills started coming due for loans I'd never signed for. But by then, it would have been too late to recover anything. Indy and I would have been left with nothing but debt and betrayal. That phone call was the best thing that ever happened to you, even though it felt like the worst. Carrie nodded, watching Finch help Indy organize a game for her party guests. It was exactly the best thing that ever happened to me. It just took me a while to understand that. As the sun set on Indy's birthday celebration, as friends departed and cleanup began, Carrie felt a profound sense of peace. The life she was living now, honest, secure, surrounded by people who'd proven their loyalty through crisis, was worth every difficult moment she'd endured to get here. The phone call had been the catalyst, but the real victory was what came after. The decision to fight back, the refusal to be a victim, the determination to ensure that betrayal came with consequences. Carrie had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to destroy the lies that are poisoning them. Even when it's painful. Even when people tell you to just move on, to forgive and forget. Some things shouldn't be forgiven. Some people don't deserve second chances. And sometimes, the only way to protect what matters most is to ensure that those who would harm you face the full consequences of their actions. The woman who'd answered that phone call 2 years ago had been naive enough to trust completely. The woman she'd become was wise enough to verify everything. That transformation, painful as it had been, was the real gift that came from discovering the truth. In her new life, surrounded by people who'd earned their place there, Carrie finally understood what real security felt like. Not the illusion of safety built on lies and false promises, but the genuine peace that came from knowing exactly where you stood and who you could count on. The phone call had ended her marriage, but it had saved her life. And as she tucked Indy into bed that night, kissing her daughter's forehead and promising her that tomorrow would be another good day, Carrie knew that some prices were worth paying. Justice had been served. Truth had prevailed. And they were finally, genuinely, safe. If you've learned anything from Carrie's story, let it be this. You are stronger than you know, smarter than your betrayer thinks, and deserving of a life built on truth rather than lies. Don't settle for less than you deserve, and never let anyone convince you that seeking justice makes you the villain. Your story doesn't end with betrayal, it begins with what you choose to do about it.